Hello and welcome to this first video in the Fulcrum Leaders Leadership Series. Today I'm delighted to say that we have with us Professor Judge Mervyn King, who's over here from South Africa, and Mervyn will be talking to us about integrity in leadership. He'll be reflecting on the work he did with Nelson Mandela and also talking to us about sustainable capitalism in the 21st century. So much has happened in the last 18 months. What are your thoughts and how do you keep the faith?
I take 2 pills every morning. One is passion and one is dedication. I'm passionate about what I do and I'm dedicated to it because I'm one of those who believes if we don't get it right now, the way companies, both public and private, operate, in the sense of operating in what the United Nations has now called the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, namely the economy, society, and the environment. If we don't get the business model right, both in public and private companies, so that it has a positive impact on those 3, then we're not going to achieve sustainable development. And I'm afraid we won't have a sustainable world by the end of the century.
And of course, you continue to champion integrated reporting. You must be delighted with the progress that you're making.
Yes, I've always said that it's the thinking that's more important than the report itself. Again, reality has dictated that it's no longer an option to carry on business as usual. And by that, I mean in the Milton Friedman garb, that, as you know, his thesis was the sole purpose of the company, he called it the corporation. The sole purpose of the company is to make profit without deception. Now, tacit in that was, if at any cost. So people focused on the creation of monetary gain and the maximization of shareholder wealth. And it was being subsidized by society and the environment. And I always give the example because it's an industry that I was chairman of the largest textile company in the Southern Hemisphere, so I understand the textile industry. And a dye house is about 30 times the size of this building we're sitting in. It's huge, and plant machinery is huge. So when you've woven a cotton fabric, such as my shirt, and you're going to dye it grey, the color of my shirt, it's very toxic, the chemicals. And after it's gone through the process and there's a lot of water and steam, it goes into a tank with a big valve on. And as a good corporate citizen, you should treat those toxins before you open the valve to put it to the waste, which goes into a river. To treat it, you need qualified chemists to treat it because it's a chemical process. So if you didn't do that, and you just let it go into the tank and opened the valve, and those toxins went into the waste into the river, it would kill fish in the river. It will kill plant life along the river. It will result in the local authority that depends on that river for its water having to spend more money removing the toxins from the water before putting it into the water infrastructure of the people in that town. So you can see on those steps, although the monetary bottom line of that dye house would have increased because the expenditure would be reduced, it was being subsidized by society and the environment. And that's what I say was the free part of Milton Friedman's free economy, when you had the increase in the bottom line being subsidized by society and the environment. It's fascinating to me that society, who created the company, this artificial person with limited liability, dealt with this not by looking at how the company was carrying on completely lawfully, but was committing wrongs against society and the environment. So it's an oxymoron, but I've coined the phrase the company through the 20th century committed lawful wrongs. And those wrongs were against society and the environment. And what did society do? They started regulating the outcomes or the impacts of the company's business model. No one thought of saying, but what about the source? So when you're not feeling well, let's see, and you've got aches and pains and you go to the doctor looks at your aches and pains and analyzes those symptoms and the cause. Let's say you've got a virus in your kidney. He treats the kidney. He doesn't treat those symptoms. Society was treating the symptoms of how business was being carried on. A lot of companies operating today are actually destroying value. Might be increasing a bottom line, but the business model is such that it's actually destroying value. So integrated thinking drives the collective mind of a board to deal with it at source, the virus in the kidney, not waiting for the symptoms.
But looking back over the years, Mervyn, I know it hasn't always been, it wasn't always an easy start for you. You grew up in a South Africa that presented problems for you and your family. Can you tell me a bit about that and how that influenced the trajectory of your career and your life?
My father was born in Zululand, which is the north of Natal, one of the provinces of South Africa, and his best friend was a Zulu man. And then the Nationalist Party came to power with their apartheid policies. So, for example, he couldn't go to a restaurant with his Zulu friend, and he couldn't have his Zulu friend to his house. And he said, I'm not living in this country. And he emigrated to then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. When I was ending my school years, my father lost his job in Rhodesia, as it then was, and with his tail between his legs came back to South Africa looking for a job, which he found, and then I went to university in South Africa. But that set me on a path that I turned my face against what was happening in our country. And so I ended up on the finance committee for Helen Suzman, who was the sole voice in Parliament talking against apartheid, and supporting what was then the Progressive Party. Today is the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. So it wasn't easy because it was a strange thing, but people outside thought every white person in South Africa was pro-apartheid. Of course, that wasn't the case at all. There were many white people who went to jail for life. Bram Fisher, a barrister practicing at the Johannesburg bar with me, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for his conduct on the grounds that he was guilty of treason. He was as much guilty as treason as the man in the moon. But the apartheid government created statutory treason. If you opposed the policies, you were committing treason against the state.
But you became the country's youngest Supreme Court judge and then resigned after an altercation with PW Botha. That must have been a difficult decision given everything you'd done to achieve that.
It was, but it was the right thing to do in my judgment. There was a fellow judge, his name was Anton Mostert. He died unfortunately of cancer at quite a young age, his early 60s. And he had headed a commission of inquiry into an English language newspaper that sprung up. Now, the English language newspapers were always anti-apartheid. The Afrikaans language newspapers were pro-apartheid. And suddenly there was an English language newspaper that sprung up called The Citizen that was pro-apartheid. And there were allegations being made that this was a mouthpiece of the government of the day. So a commission of inquiry was set up, and this brother judge of mine was sitting as the commissioner, white Afrikaans-speaking Nationalist Party supporter judge. And he came to see me in my chambers one day and said, I've come to consult with you because I know you're not a Nationalist Party supporter. And he said, I've been appointed by the state president on this commission. And he said, evidence is being led before me that there is a budget that's been created in the state president's office. And the money has been taken from taxpayers and been used to buy the printing machinery and everything to start the citizen newspaper. So I said, well, then the allegations seem to have been proven. And he says, but my difficulty is my terms of my appointment are that it must be held in camera. Nobody should know what's going on. And I must report only to the state president, no one else, the conclusions I come to. I said, Anton, you are a judge and you've got inherent powers. If you were sitting in a court and you heard this, what would you do? He said, I will refer it to the Attorney General, Crown Prosecution Services in UK language, to the Attorney General to investigate and for prosecution. I said, well, that's what you have to do. And I said, you've got to do it publicly. You can't do it in camera. I said, oh, I could never do this. Anyway, so let me think about it. He went away. A couple of days later, he came. He said, I've been thinking about it. You're right. I said, I can't sleep. I don't know what to do. So I accompanied him to discuss this with the state president. And the state president tried to persuade us not to do it because I had advised him to call a press conference. And anyhow, we called that press conference was called. He, of course, faced the press. I was sitting in the audience, and he broke this thing open, and it was a huge storm. And the night before, the brother of the Minister of Finance fled South Africa. So did the minister in the state president's office fled South Africa because they were in charge of this budget. And they fled to a villa on the Lake Geneva. So in buying the plant machinery, they'd over-invoiced and kept money offshore. And so it was a huge, can you imagine that story in South Africa at that time? So it was huge. And so he resigned and I resigned.
So in terms of that decision, how easy was it in the sense of it was the right thing to do, but were there sleepless nights? Was it something you had to really reflect on hard, or what was that like for you?
Let's see, I've always in my life believed that things are black or white. I don't like grey areas. And to me, it was black or white, and I wasn't going to live in a grey area. And to me, to have stayed on the bench was starting to give me, my flesh was feeling like chicken flesh at the time. So for me, it was a decision. It was black or white, and it was easy. And so you have this dithering in making a decision when it's grey, But to me, the answer was clear.
And of course, you worked closely with Nelson Mandela. Can you just tell me a little bit about what that was like?
Well, so I worked closely with him is perhaps an exaggeration. I was an article clerk learning my articles to become a lawyer. He was already a qualified lawyer. And he had started the first black practice with his partner, Mandela and Tamba, in a very derelict building in a street called Fox Street, which was to the side entrance to the Magistrates' Court in Johannesburg, the Magistrates' Court being our lower court, the same as here in the UK. And I used to go in that side entrance because there was a parking ground right next to his building, the building that he was in. And so going into court, in court those days at the bar, now in my final year of articles, we were entitled to appear in certain cases. And the bar was divided for white lawyers and black lawyers at the bar. And I was in this matter where Mr. Mandela was on the black side and I was on the white side. I just thought this was ridiculous. So I went and sat on the side with him. And the magistrate was very annoyed. He adjourned the court and he called us into court and he said, it's not the right way. You know what it is. And you keep on calling him your learned friend. So that little incident, he and I started talking. And then, of course, there was the Rivonia trial where he was accused of treason. And he went to jail for life. While he was in jail, I chaired an organization called Operation Hunger with his two daughters. And that was formed because the hardships of apartheid was really in the rural areas, not in the urban areas. Because the apartheid, the policy was to put them into homelands, so according to their tribes, so the Venda homeland, the Zulu homeland, etc. And some of these homelands were sort of non-arable ground, so there was real hardship. And I, at the time, was the chairman of the biggest distribution company in South Africa, fast-moving consumer goods. So I was the biggest buyer of food products. So I got all these food producers to develop a nutritional package which cost 34 cents a day. And we fed 2.5 million children for 20 years while Mr. Mandela was in jail. When he came out of jail, he had a lunch for 12 people. I was one of the 12. And he went around the table saying, well, I invited each person. He said, well, the judge, he always called me the judge. The judge, he said, I invited because if it wasn't for Operation Hunger, there'd be millions of useless people in South Africa today. So because we don't feed a child under 3, it's called kwashiorkor, their brains atrophy. Mr. Mandela often phoned me to talk to me about issues. And whenever he wanted me to do something which involved a lot of work without remuneration, it would start with, how's my favorite judge? And then would follow. And it was he who, when I was asked to write a report on how to direct and how to manage, for the majority of my fellow citizens who had not been in the mainstream of the economy, he said, do it. You're the right man. But put your hand on your heart and let them all put their hand on their hearts. Do it in the interest of South Africa, Inc. Nobody charges. That's exactly what I did.
Mervyn, coming back to this issue of integrity and ethical behaviour, it's at the heart of your message to board leaders that you're working with. But how easy is it to do the right thing?
Private sector, from a point of view of ethics, is actually ahead of the political or the public sector. And very interestingly, asset owners and asset managers are paying a premium for the equity of companies that are operating on a basis of quality governance. So they're an island of quality governance in a sea of corruption. Because what these asset owners have learned, that these are extraordinary people, that if they can actually operate on a foundation of ethics, ethical and effective leadership in this corrupt environment, then this is quality management which you can entrust your beneficiaries' money in the equity of that company. And that company is probably going to survive and thrive long term, because this is a board that's applying its mind. I have developed around the world the image of a river. And the river is the self, it's yourself. And what you need to do is, as a politician and as a director, you've got to cross that self-river. You have to leave behind self-interest. You have to leave behind self-concern. You've got to cross that self-river into the area of intellectual honesty, that honest application of mind, knowing that you're a member of Homo sapiens, therefore you're prone to human frailty, that you've got present needs, you've got past experiences, but you've got to put all that aside. And you've got to make a decision as a politician in the best interest of the citizens of that country, not self-interest for yourself and your family or your friends or your... And the same thing, the director has to cross into that area of intellectual honesty and make that business judgment call in the best interest of that incapacitated, inanimate person, the company, that's dependent on the director, heart, mind, and soul, because it has no body to be kicked, no soul to be damned, and has no conscience. The conscious company is the conscience of the directors. The reputation of the company is how the directors behave. And I say that everybody should achieve the following 4 outcomes: ethical culture and effective leadership, value creation in a sustainable manner, adequate and effective controls and oversight, and trust and confidence in that organization with legitimacy of operations. Now, if you achieve that, you must have been practicing good governance. And if you achieve that, you will be adding value to society. Whether you're a political government or a public company or a small company or a municipality or a non-profit organization.